Welcome back to the Dispute.a podcast. I'm Paul. This is episode 7. This episode is about a situation a lot of off-plan buyers find themselves in and very few plan for. They signed a payment plan, circumstances changed. They can no longer sustain the schedule, and now they're trying to work out what, if anything, can be done about it. The honest framing of this episode is payment plan restructuring is possible more often than buyers fear, but it's bounded more tightly than buyers hope. Let's work through where the real boundaries are, how buyers end up here. Off-plan payment plans are commitments made at one point in time that have to be sustained across years. A lot can change across years. A buyer's income can fall, a job can end, a business can turn down. A currency the buyer earns in can move sharply against the diameter. A buyer who comfortably afforded the schedule when they signed can find, 2 years in, that the same schedule is no longer sustainable. How buyers end up here. Off-plan payment plans are commitments made at one point in time that have to be sustained across years. A lot can change across years. A buyer's income can fall, a job can end, a business can turn down. A currency the buyer earns in can move sharply against the diameter. A buyer who comfortably afforded the schedule when they signed can find, 2 years in, that the same schedule is no longer sustainable. The first principle: engage before you default. The single most important thing in this whole episode is the timing of engagement. A buyer who sees the difficulty coming and engages. The developer, before missing payments, is in a fundamentally different position than a buyer who simply stops paying and waits for the developer to react. Before default, the buyer is a paying customer with a cash flow problem, asking for an accommodation. The developer's incentive is to keep a paying customer paying, even at a slower or restructured pace. That's a conversation with room in it. After default, the buyer has triggered the developer's contractual and statutory rights, the Article 11 machinery we covered in episode 5. The conversation is now happening in the shadow of the developer's right to terminate and retain. The room has narrowed sharply, that the buyers who restructure successfully are, overwhelmingly, the ones who engaged early. The buyers who end up with the worst outcomes are, overwhelmingly, the ones who went silent and let the default happen before they said anything. If you take one thing from this episode, the moment you can see that the schedule is becoming unsustainable, it's the moment to start the conversation, not the moment you miss the payment. What is actually negotiable? So what can actually be restructured? Several things with varying degrees of difficulty. The schedule itself is the most negotiable element, stretching the remaining payments over a longer period, reducing the size of individual installments while extending the timeline. Developers can often accommodate this because it keeps the money coming and keeps the buyer in the project. The timing around milestones can sometimes flex. Off-plan payment plans are often linked to construction milestones. There can be room to adjust how the buyer's payments map onto those milestones. A pause or grace period is harder, but not impossible. A defined, temporary suspension of payments, with the schedule resuming and extending afterwards, is something some developers will consider. For a buyer with a genuine, temporary, well-documented difficulty, a switch to a different unit, sometimes on the table, where a buyer's difficulty is fundamentally that they committed too much. Moving to a smaller or less expensive unit can be a structural solution. The developer prefers to a default, what is much harder to negotiate, and then the things that are much harder. The total price is rarely negotiable. Restructuring is about how and when the buyer pays, not, generally, how much. Amounts already paid are rarely recoverable through restructuring. Restructuring is forward-looking. A buyer wanting money back is not in a restructuring conversation. They're in a cancellation conversation. A walk away with no consequence is not restructuring at all. If the buyer's actual goal is to exit entirely, that's spare cancellation, governed by the realities we covered in episodes 4 and 5. The developer's view of restructuring. Why would a developer agree to restructure at all? Because often, it's the rational choice for them. A restructured buyer who keeps paying is worth more to the developer than a defaulted buyer whose unit has to be reclaimed, processed through the Article 11 machinery, and resold. The reclaim mandricel path has costs, delays, and uncertainty for the developer too. This is the buyer's leverage in a restructuring conversation. The buyer is not asking for charity. The buyer is offering the developer the better of two outcomes: a paying buyer on a revised schedule versus a default that costs the developer time and money to process. But the developer's willingness has limits. A developer facing many buyers in difficulty may resist restructuring any single one for the precedent reason. A developer whose own cash flow depends on the original schedule may not be able to afford the accommodation. How a structured approach helps. This is a situation where a structured pre-legal approach earns its place clearly. A buyer approaching restructuring alone often makes one of two mistakes. They approach too late after default, Or they approach with a vague request, "I'm struggling. Can you help?" rather than a concrete, credible, documented proposal. A structured approach does the opposite. It engages early, before default. It comes with a specific proposal. Here is the revised schedule. Here is why it's sustainable where the original wasn't. And it frames the proposal in the developer's interest. It also does the honest assessment underneath. Sometimes the honest assessment is that the buyer's situation isn't a restructuring problem at all, that no realistic revised schedule is sustainable, and the buyer's real decision is a managed exit rather than a restructure. Restructuring is a forward-looking conversation about pace, not price, and it works best when it starts before the default. Framed as the better of two outcomes for the developer. What to take from this episode? Buyers end up unable to sustain payment plans for many reasons. The cause matters. The first principle is to engage before you default. Before default, you're a paying customer asking for an accommodation. After default, you're negotiating in the shadow of the developers. Termination and retention rights. What's negotiable? The schedule, the milestone timing, sometimes a defined pause, sometimes a switch to a different unit. What's much harder? The total price, recovery of amounts already paid, a consequence-free walk away. The developer's willingness to restructure comes from restructuring often being their rational choice too. That's the buyer's genuine leverage. A structured approach engages early, brings a concrete, documented proposal, frames it in the developer's interest, and honestly tells the buyer when their situation isn't a restructuring problem at all. In the next episode, we look at one of the hardest decisions in any dispute, knowing when to walk away. Thanks for listening. The full transcript is at transcript.a. For pre-legal dispute support, dispute.a, that work is done.